The town hall was buzzing that evening, the kind of small, town buzz that comes when something big is about to be decided. The air was thick with perfume, cheap coffee, and the faint scent of damp paper. Folding chairs creaked as neighbors whispered and exchanged knowing looks. The glossy banner at the front read, "FICHO Monthly Development Meeting, Building a Better Future Together." Jack Turner sat near the back, his worn hat on his knee, thumb tracing the edge of a folded map. His hands were rough, hands that had turned the soil of the same farm his father once plowed, hands that could mend a fence by feel alone. But tonight, they shook. Not from fear, but from frustration. He had spent the last 3 months watching concrete trucks climb the mountain above his land, each load another step toward what he knew would be disaster. When his name was called, he stood slowly. The HOA board, 5 well-dressed faces in pastel blazers and polished smiles, watched him as though he were an interruption to their dinner reservations. He stepped forward, boots echoing on the linoleum floor, and set a stack of papers on the podium. "I've run tests," he began, voice steady, "and the soil on that mountain slope isn't stable. You're putting too much weight up there. You build that reservoir, and the first real storm we get, that water's coming down." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people glanced at each other, uneasy. But at the front of the table, Mrs. Evelyn Bellinger, the HO president, raised one perfectly plucked eyebrow and smirked. "Mr. Turner," she said, voice dripping with condescension, "we've already had engineers assess the land. They said it's perfectly safe. Perhaps your farming experience doesn't qualify you to question professional reports." Jack clenched his jaw. "Ma'am, I've lived under that mountain my whole life. I know the way the earth shifts after rain. You've got shale under there, cracked and slick as glass. You start storing water above that. It's not a matter of if it gives way, but when." From the front row, one of the board members chuckled. "Come on, Jack. We're building a reservoir, not a volcano. What's the worst that can happen? Your cows get a little wet." Laughter rippled through the room. Jack's eyes darkened, but he didn't raise his voice. "When that wall goes, it won't just flood my farm. The water'll take out everything below it. Your houses, your streets. That fancy park you're planning for the kids. You think nature cares about your HOA rules?" Mrs. Bellinger leaned back, twirling her pen. "This meeting isn't for scare tactics," she said sharply. "We're here to discuss community progress. That reservoir will raise property values for everyone in the valley. It'll provide irrigation for new developments, recreational space, beauty. You of all people should appreciate a little modernization." Jack stared at her. "You're calling greed progress." The room fell quiet. Her lips tightened. "I'll remind you, Mr. Turner, this is private HOA business. Your property sits on the edge of our jurisdiction, but we've been kind enough to keep you in the loop. You don't even pay dues." Jack gave a dry laugh. "You're right. I don't pay to ruin the land that feeds my family." He opened his folder, spreading a map on the podium. Lines and markings covered it in red and blue ink. "Here's your planned reservoir. Right here," he said, pointing to the shaded outline near the top of the slope. "And here," he drew a finger down toward the bottom, "is the fracture line running under it. I've got soil core samples and runoff data from the last 10 years. Every heavy rain pushes that line closer to the surface. You can ignore me, but you can't argue with gravity." Mrs. Bellinger rolled her eyes, tapping her manicured nails against the table. "Enough, Mr. Turner. We've already voted. The project's approved. The construction's halfway done. If you have an actual permit concern, you can file it formally with the county." Jack stared at her, searching for any flicker of reason, but all he saw were empty smiles and folded arms. "You're not listening," he said quietly. "We've listened plenty." She snapped. "Now, please take your doomsday theories elsewhere. We have landscaping budgets to review." A few chuckles echoed again from the back of the room. Jack gathered his papers, trying to steady his breathing. He wanted to yell, to tell them what he'd seen that morning. Cracks in the base soil already starting to appear where they'd been pouring concrete. But he knew it wouldn't matter. They didn't see land, they saw dollar signs and lakefront properties. He turned to leave, stopping just before the door. "I hope you're right," he said, his voice low but cutting through the laughter. "Because if I'm right, you'll have blood on your hands before the year's out." The room went silent. Mrs. Bellinger gave a forced laugh and waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, please. The man thinks he's a prophet now." Jack walked out into the night. The air outside was cool and heavy with the scent of pine and damp soil. Clouds were rolling over the mountain ridge, turning the moonlight dim. He stood by his old pickup, staring up at the slope, From this distance, he could see the construction lights still glowing, workers moving like ants, machinery roaring as they built higher and higher. The sound echoed down the valley, low and threatening. He sighed, running a hand over his face. He'd tried. He'd gone to the county inspector, but the HOA had influence there too. Donations, committees, connections. They'd called him a concerned but misinformed citizen. Even the local paper had printed a piece calling him Old Man Turner, the doomsayer of Dry Creek. But he wasn't wrong. He'd felt the land tremble before storms, seen how water cut into the soft rock like a knife through butter. His father had warned him about that slope decades ago. The mountain gives, boy, his father had said. Not all at once. It waits. Then it takes everything. He climbed into his truck, headlights cutting through the drizzle. The mountain loomed above, a dark wall against the horizon. Lightning flickered, lighting up the dam site for a split second. Steel beams, fresh concrete, and the beginnings of a containment wall that looked far too thin for the weight it was meant to hold. As thunder rolled, Jack muttered to himself, "They'll see. When it breaks, they'll remember." He drove home down the winding road to his farm. His house sat low in the valley, surrounded by his fields and the old red barn his grandfather had built. The creek that ran beside it shimmered faintly in the stormlight. He parked the truck, stepped out, and stared up at the mountain again. The construction lights up there looked like stars. Cold, artificial, and careless. He could almost imagine the water already gathering behind that wall, pressing, waiting. Inside his house, he spread the maps across the kitchen table once more. He marked new spots with a red pen, where runoff had already shifted, where the new construction had diverted natural drainage. His mind was racing, filled with numbers, slopes, rainfall predictions. He knew he had to prepare. He glanced toward the window. The rain had started to fall harder now, pattering against the glass. Somewhere far above, a faint rumble echoed. Not thunder this time, but the sound of machinery clanking through the night. Jack whispered, "You're playing with a mountain, and the mountain always wins." Then, with a deep breath, he folded the maps carefully, slid them into an envelope labeled, "In case of flood," and tucked it in his desk drawer. He turned off the lights, the storm outside growing louder. The reservoir wasn't finished yet, but he already knew how this story would end.
The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, a relentless downpour that turned the mountain trails into rivers of mud. Jack Turner sat in his dimly lit kitchen, the old radio crackling beside a half-empty cup of coffee gone cold. The window pane rattled under the wind's howl, and through it, he could see the faint glow of floodlights high on the mountain, the reservoir site. Even from miles away, it looked uneasy. The water level must have been rising fast. He'd warned them. Over and over, he'd told them that this kind of weather would be the breaking point. But warnings didn't stop progress, not in this town. The news on the radio was grim. Flash flood warning remains in effect for Dry Creek Valley and surrounding areas. The announcer said, voice shaking under static. Residents are advised to move to higher ground. Evacuations are being ordered for properties near the newly constructed lakeside reservoir. Jack's head jerked up. The words hit him like a hammer. He grabbed his raincoat and flashlight and stepped outside. The world had become a sheet of moving water. His boots sank into the mud as he made his way toward the barn, the wind nearly ripping the door from his hands when he pulled it open. Inside, his old tractor sat covered in dust, a silent relic of quieter years. "Not tonight, old girl," he muttered, patting the hood. "We're gonna need you awake." He climbed up, turned the key, and after a few angry sputters, the engine coughed to life. He steered the tractor toward a small hill at the far end of his property, the only real high ground nearby. The creek beside his fields was already swollen, frothing white as it overflowed its banks. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled the air. As he climbed the hill, lightning tore across the sky, and for a moment the entire valley lit up like daylight. He saw it then, the dam wall, far above, silhouetted against the storm. The water was higher than it should have been, lapping at the top edge. A thin jet of water shot from one side, almost invisible in the rain, but Jack knew what that meant. Pressure, the kind that didn't hold for long. He stopped the tractor and stared. His heart hammered in his chest. He could almost hear his father's voice again. "The mountain gives, boy. When it's ready, nothing stands in its way." Down in the valley, lights flickered through the sheets of rain. The HOA neighborhood. Rows of shiny new houses lined the hillside, each with trimmed lawns and decorative lampposts, all built to face the view of that shimmering man-made lake. A few SUVs were already leaving, their headlights slicing through the storm as families scrambled to evacuate. Too late, Jack thought. Way too late. The wind shifted, carrying a deep, rolling sound, not thunder, not quite. It was something lower, a groan that seemed to come from inside the mountain itself. Jack turned toward the dam and saw it. Cracks spider, webbing across the concrete face, widening with each passing second. Water gushed from them in thin, violent streams. Then, in one blinding flash of lightning, the top corner of the wall gave way. The world went silent for half a heartbeat. Then came the roar. The reservoir exploded outward, a monstrous wall of black water crashing down the slope, swallowing trees, rocks, and everything in its path. The sound was deafening, like the earth itself was tearing apart. Jack gripped the steering wheel of his tractor as the shockwave of air hit him, shaking the ground beneath his tires. He watched in frozen awe and horror as the flood surged downward, straight toward the neighborhood. Streetlights flickered and vanished one by one as the water devoured them. The polished driveways, the neat rows of houses, the community pool gone in seconds. It was as if the mountain had decided to reclaim everything they'd stolen from it. Jack's eyes stung with rain and mud. He climbed down from the tractor, shielding his face from the spray. The sheer power of it was unreal. He could hear the screams now, faint and lost in the wind, the panicked shouts of people who had never believed danger could reach them. Cars floated past like toys, spinning helplessly in the torrent. A house tore free from its foundation, breaking apart as it slammed into another. Pieces of roofs and fences tumbled down, vanishing into the dark. Jack backed further up the hill, the floodwater creeping closer, dragging chunks of debris and uprooted trees with it. The ground trembled under his boots. For a moment, he thought the wave might take him too. He grabbed onto a fence post and held tight as a surge of muddy water rushed past, stopping just a few feet below where he stood. And then, as suddenly as it began, the roar began to fade. The torrent had lost its fury, spreading across the valley floor and settling into a churning brown sea. Everything below him, the farm, the roads, the once proud lakeside estates, was gone. Jack stood there, soaked to the bone, breathing hard. Lightning flashed again, revealing the wreckage. Cars lay overturned in the mud. Roofs floated like driftwood. The HOA grand stone sign, "Welcome to Lakeside Estates," a premier community, lay cracked in half, buried. He stumbled down the slope, mud clinging to his boots. When he reached what was once his farm, he stopped beside the twisted remnants of his barn. The smell of wet earth and gasoline filled the air. His tractor, miraculously, was still on the hill behind him, untouched. But everything else he'd built, every fence and tool shed, was gone. He turned toward where the neighborhood had stood. Fires flickered in the distance where gas lines had ruptured. The night was eerily quiet now, broken only by the hiss of rain on smoldering wreckage. Jack walked slowly through the ruins, flashlight cutting through the mist. He found what was left of the community center, the same hall where they'd laughed at him months ago. The roof was gone, walls caved in. The banner still clung to one corner, torn but legible, building a better future together. He stopped in front of it, letting the words sink in. The irony burned in his chest. He could almost hear Mrs. Bellinger's voice again, smug and dismissive, telling him he was paranoid. Progress. He muttered under his breath. That's what you called it. The flashlight beam caught something glinting in the mud. Her gold HOA pin, shaped like a little house with the letters L.E. engraved. He picked it up, wiped the dirt away, and stared at it for a long time. Then he slipped it into his pocket and kept walking. The storm finally began to ease, the rain thinning to a drizzle. Dawn was still hours away, but the horizon had begun to glow faintly, pale and gray. The mountain loomed above, its slopes scarred and raw where the reservoir had once sat. Steam rose from the shattered concrete like smoke from a wound. Jack climbed a little rise where his porch used to be and stood there, gazing across what was now a vast, muddy lake. The water stretched out as far as he could see, covering the valley in silence. He didn't smile, not really. But there was a grim kind of peace in his eyes, the peace of a man who had seen justice done by forces greater than any board or bylaw. They built their mountain lake, he said softly, almost to himself, and now they've got it. The wind blew gently through the broken trees, carrying away the last echoes of the storm. Jack turned and began the long walk back up toward the hill, leaving behind the wreckage of both his farm and their pride, knowing that, for once, nature had spoken louder than any HOA ever could.